In this lesson, you will learn how to solve quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. I highly recommend putting a negative 1 in front of that b so that you can correctly calculate this portion of the formula. Recall from our previous lesson that this b squared minus 4ac is called our discriminant. It tells us how many and what type of solutions we will have. The quadratic formula works well for equations that are in standard form. Ax squared plus bx plus c. That way we can name our a, b, and c values to plug in to that quadratic formula. It does work for all functions that are in standard form. The quadratic formula will not work with quadratics that are in vertex form. Let's look at our first example. You do not need to copy this entire word problem. We will copy the function and some other important information while we work this problem. So we have the height and feet of a diver above the water can be modeled by that function. So copy that to your paper. Where t is time in seconds after the diver jumps off a platform, we're going to find the time it takes for the diver to reach the water. So we have our function for question number 1. We have negative 16t squared plus 8t plus 8. Where t is time in seconds. We're going to find the time it takes for the diver to reach the water. So if you imagine this picture of a diver on a platform, it is a quadratic shape. We see that parabola, the U shape. We are trying to find this point when the diver reaches the water. So that would be our x-axis, our x-intercept. So that means we can let our y value, h of t, equal 0. So with this in the correct standard form, we can now solve using the quadratic formula. We'll need to first start by naming our a, b, and c values. So here a equals negative 16, b equals 8, and c equals 8. We will plug these values into quadratic formula. And you could actually start with the entire quadratic formula. However, I recommend that students first start with the discriminant and then plug in the other pieces and parts. So let's first just calculate b squared minus 4ac. So we have 8 squared minus 4 times our a value, which is negative 16, times c. When we calculate the value of that discriminant, of course you could use order of operation or just let the calculator handle that for you. So b squared minus 4 times our a times our c, all of that equals a value of 576. So this means that we're going to get 2 real solutions. So let's go and find those solutions with the quadratic formula. So it's negative b, so do negative 1 times b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac is what goes inside. Well, we just calculated the discriminant to be 576. So all of that is over 2a, and our a is negative 16. This typically would equal x. However, our variable is t in this case. So let's simplify each part. Here we have negative 1 times 8, so that's negative 8, plus or minus the square root of 576 gives us 24, over 2 times negative 16 gives us a negative 32. So we have simplified as far as we can go, and now we need to deal with this plus or minus. So we'll separate out and do negative 8 minus 24 divided by negative 32. And we will need to do negative 8 plus 24 divided by negative 32. Rewriting the problem exactly as we have it, doing our plus and our minus symbol. Make sure you do both in order to evaluate correctly. So let's continue by simplifying. Here we have negative 8 minus 24. So negative 8 minus 24 gives us negative 32. And then we need to divide that by negative 32. So negative divided by negative gives us a positive 1. For our second solution, we get negative 8 plus 24. That gives us a positive 16. And we're going to divide that by negative 32. So 16 divided by negative 32 gives us a negative 0.5. So let's go back and talk about what we were finding here. We were asked to find the time it takes for the diver to reach the water. So we're reaching here at this point, our x-intercept. We found our solutions to be 1 and negative 0.5. Negative 0.5 is called an extraneous solution. Extraneous solution. That is because time does not make sense to be negative in this situation. The solution that we will use for our answer will be the 1. The diver will reach the water after 1 second. Our discriminant told us we would get 2 real solutions. So we did get 2 real solutions, the negative 0.5 and the positive 1. However, for this situation, only the 1 makes sense. Let's take a look at our next example. Example number 2. Here we have negative 5 plus 3x equals negative 2x squared. Before we can begin and name our a, b, and c, we must have it in standard form where the equation is set equal to 0. So let's solve by adding our 2x squared to both sides. There's no like terms to combine it with, so we'll just write them in the correct order. The 2x squared is first. I'm going to go ahead and list the 3x next, and then finally the minus 5. And that does equal 0 because those cancel out, leaving us with our 0. Now we can name our a, b, and c values. So a is 2, b is 3, and c is negative 5. Feel free to go ahead and plug everything into the quadratic formula. It is my preference to go ahead and just start with the discriminant first. So b squared minus 4ac, I take my 3 squared minus 4 times a times c, being very careful that I correctly plug in the numbers for a, b, and c into that formula. When I calculate the value of the discriminant, go ahead and type that into our calculator. We have 3 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 5. Try that again. There we go. B squared minus 4AC, that is now equal to 49. So because that is positive, I'm going to get 2 real solutions. So let's find those now. We have x equals negative b. We're using our quadratic formula now. So plugging in that 3 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, we just calculated that discriminant to find 49. And then all of that is over 2a, so 2 times our a is 2. Stop and make sure that you've correctly plugged things in before moving on. Here we're going to take -1 times 3, so we get -3 plus or minus 49 is a perfect square, so the square root of that is 7, all over 2 times 2 is 4. So we've simplified as far as we can, so now we need to deal with this plus or minus sign. So we're going to take -3 minus 7 and divide that by 4, as well as -3 plus 7 and divide by 4. Be very careful, it's not the 3 that is plus or minus, it is the 7. So let's simplify each of these. -3 minus 7 is -10. We're going to divide that by 4. -10 divided by 4, that does give us a decimal, and because it terminates, we could leave that as a decimal. However, we prefer fraction answer, so math fraction will change that to -5/2. In our other solution, we get -3 plus 7, so that gives us a +4 divided by 4, which gives us 1. So our solutions in set notation would be -5/2, 1. Doing them least to greatest in that set notation, the squiggly lines, not in parentheses, it's not an ordered pair. This is a value for x, and that is a value for x. Let's look at our next example, number 3. We have 2x squared minus 15x plus 12 equals -7x plus 5. So again, we must first start by getting our terms all on the same side and set equal to 0. Be careful, it looks like you can name A, B, and C as it's written. However, it's not set equal to 0. So let's add 7x and line it up with its like term. Subtract 5 and again line it up with its like term. We have 2x squared, -15x plus 7x gives us a -8x. And then 12 take away 5 gives us a +7. These terms cancel, now leaving it set equal to 0. This is the moment that we can name our A, B, and C. Make sure it's in standard form, set equal to 0 before you start solving. So A equals 2, B equals -8, and C equals 7. Let's start with the discriminant first. So b squared minus 4ac. B is a -8. It is very important because we want to square that b value that we put it in parentheses. Without the parentheses, it's going to cause you to get the wrong value for your discriminant. So b squared minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 7, and then we can calculate that value with our calculator. B squared minus 4 times a times c, all of that equals an 8. So that being positive tells us we will get 2 real solutions. So let's solve for those. We have x equals -b, and our b is -8. So again, this is why it's very important to go ahead and make that -1 times b so we can later deal with that when we're simplifying. We have plus or minus the square root. Let's put our discriminant inside of that radical. All over 2 times a, and our a value is 2. So let's simplify each little part. Negative times negative is a positive. Plus or minus Well, 8 is not a perfect square, so we're going to have to go and do our prime factorization. So for the square root of 8, we have to do our prime factors. With the prime factorization, we see that there's a pair of 2's, and one of the 2's stays inside the radical. So we have 2, the square root of 2. This pair of 2's gets to come out as a 2. This 2 has to stay inside. So 2 times 2 is 4. We can't go much further as far as adding or subtracting because 8 plus 2 the square root of 2 and 8 minus 2 the square root of 2, you cannot combine them. They're not like terms. However, we can reduce because of these numbers all being divisible by 2. Now, I'm not including the radicand inside that radical. The 8, 2, and 4, they're all outside the radical, are divisible by 2. So reduce your fraction. 8 divided by 2 is 4, plus or minus 2 divided by 2 is 1. Keep the square root of 2. We cannot divide that one by 2 because it's not really a 2. Over, divide 4 by 2. So our solution is 4 plus or minus the square root of 2 over 2. That 1 is no longer necessary. So for our set notation, we get 4 minus the square root of 2 over 2. It would be smaller because you're subtracting. And then 4 plus the square root of 2 over 2. Let's take a look at our last example, number 4. Here we have negative 7 plus x squared minus 6x. That is set equal to 0. This one is not in standard form because our ax squared term, then our bx, and then c. So let's rewrite them in the correct order. It is already set equal to 0, but make sure they're in the right order before you name your a, b, and c. So x squared is positive, so we can bring that to the front. Minus 6x, so make sure you include your sign with that term, and then minus 7. We can now name our a, b, and c. A is 1, the number in front of that x squared. B is negative 6, and c is negative 7. Let's calculate our discriminant first. So b squared, which is negative 6 squared, again being careful it must be in parentheses, minus 4 times a times c, and then calculate that. Negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 7. That gives us a value of 64. So let's plug that into our quadratic formula. Negative b, so negative 1 times negative 6 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. Well, that's that value of the discriminant that we plug into the radical. Over 2 times a, and our a is a 1. So let's simplify each part. Negative times negative is a positive, plus or minus. The square root of 64 is 8, divided by 2 times 1 is 2. So you could think about reducing this one like we did the last problem. So 2, 6, and 8 are all divisible by 2. However, I like to go ahead and keep it with the plus or minus. So 6 minus 8, we're going to divide that by 2. And 6 plus 8, we'll divide that by 2. So 6 minus 8 gives us a negative 2. We'll divide by 2, gives us negative 1. Then we'll do 6 plus 8, gives us 14. Divide that by 2, we get 7. So our two solutions are negative 1 and 7. least to greatest in our set notation.